Thank you. It's very good to be with you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I apologize. Very noisy Kelev in the background from time to time. Um, I've known so many people in the call for so many years. In fact, the person I've known the longest, maybe a surprise, and he had to leave, but Shahaf Gal and I worked together more than 30 years ago when he was with Turk, I believe, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I was a brand new graduate student at Northwestern. And I'm certain that he made a much larger impression on me than I made on him. It's lovely to see all the people who are part of this conversation. Yael mentioned some of the big differences between the context in the US and the context in Israel, primarily size being one of those differences. But I actually think that Israel is a lovely context for thinking about partnership research, in part because it is a place where it's possible to bring together all of the different components of the educational system and work together in a way that can help align everybody. It's hard, but so that people at least can see what direction people want to move in and that the field wants to move in. It's also complex enough, I think, and the kinds of social challenges that Israel faces, the political context, the funding context, these are all things that make Israel a fantastic model for the rest of the world. So the way that you all come to think about partnership research could be very important and meaningful and have a very big impact on the way education systems and the rest of the world think about this. I also, just listening to the conversation this morning, and by the way, I want to pause and thank the translator, Marina, for all of her efforts in this work. This is, this must be the most exhausting thing mentally to do. It's exhausting for me to try to listen and make sense of everything. She's doing a fantastic job. You all, however, sound like Marina, which makes it a little harder cognitively for me to keep track of who is saying what sometimes. But thank you for the simultaneous translation. I really appreciate it. It enables me to participate in this conversation. And this is also a very challenging topic. It may be a little, what we might say, mind-bending, because it requires to fully grasp what the nature of the possibilities are with partnerships, really requires that we begin a process of shifting how we think about the nature of research, the nature of practice, and the nature of the relationships between the two. It's about a shift from thinking about how practitioners can use research, which we might call translation, to thinking about the way that research and practice works in true partnership. So it's never about taking from one and giving to the other, or it's not like walking into a supermarket and asking, what are the theories, what are the findings, what are the research ideas I can purchase today to use in my classroom tomorrow? It's about a very different way of framing, frankly, what counts as research. And it makes some of the challenges, and this is just my reflecting on some of the things I've heard each of you say in the comments, but it's about learning how not to talk about answers, right? What's the best way? What does research say? I cringe whenever I hear in my own context people talking about scientific findings about learning, because yes, there are things that we learn in psychology and in cognitive science and in other frames, but they rarely can be applied generally. What really matters is not what works, but what works for whom, in what context, under what conditions, who are the people involved, who are the resources we have, what are the goals we have. And that's really what this conversation is. So probably nobody should expect to walk away from this first meeting fully grasping everything that is being discussed. And people who are sharing ideas shouldn't expect everyone to fully grasp what you're saying. But hopefully this causes a little bit of maybe mental irritation for you, right? You think, well, this is odd. What this feeling I have about how we're talking about research and practice, the way I think about it now isn't the way I hear this person talking about it. What do I do about that? And that's really what I think a good goal maybe for me for this first meeting would be, is you start to think about that change. So now I'll start to share the ideas I was asked to prepare. And I've titled what I want to share with you, Learning Theory and Improvement Practice. So my undergraduates might say, oh, the boring part, the theory part. But in fact, the theory part is very important. And this is, again, my positionality as a researcher. I never try to pretend that I'm a practitioner in the way that someone who works in K-12 schools are. I just come at the world from a different place and face different challenges and have very different resources available to me. And that's why I partner, because I need to think about the world. I need to be introduced to the world from the practice point of view in order for us to do good work together. So the idea of theory is one of the things I can bring to the table to help us think about how we're framing these ideas. So again, that notion of how this meeting might start shifting the way we each think about practice and the way we each think about the role of research and how it relates to practice is really the goal of what I'm sharing with you. Now, all of the ideas I'm sharing with you come from a chapter that I recently wrote with a colleague of mine here at Michigan named Leslie Rupert Herringcall for a brand new handbook on improvement research in education. It was just published about a month ago. It made its debut at the meeting of the American Educational Research Association in San Diego. And it's just full of interesting writing and ideas about the nature and shape of partnerships and how we do work for improvement in education. And this one chapter that Leslie and I wrote is entitled Equitable Learning, because that to me is really the goal of this work, is to improve learning for all in a way that is deeply equitable. And there are two kinds of improvement that we talk about. I'll make this slide bigger so you can see this. You could do things better. And that is what, in fact, most educational research has been focused on throughout time, which is trying to create incremental improvement, improving test scores, improving outcomes. This is all very important work. But most of this work is framed within the constraints of current systems and structures. Given what our goals are today, how can we help everybody achieve those goals? Another way to frame improvement is doing better things. So that involves thinking about what we don't like about the way current structures and systems operate, the way the structures that we have in education produce and reproduce inequality or outcomes that are not the outcomes we might want. And as we start to think about shifts in schooling from, for instance, mass memorization of content for repetition, regurgitation on tests or exams, as we think about a shift from that frame for education to a frame where we're hoping that students can be problem solvers and critical thinkers, that requires a change in how we think about practice. And if what your goal is as a system is equity, then I would argue that equity-focused improvement work has to emphasize this kind of frame. Now, we can't make changes all at once. Change is a long process, a lot of deep investment, and that means that your planning for improvement work needs to think both about doing things better and doing better things, and have a frame in which you can shift back and forth from helping improve current practice and think about how we would shift and change the systems in order to create new kinds of practices that would lead to new and different kinds of outcomes. There's a Chinese proverb, I think it's a Chinese, things get attributed in all kinds of odd ways that I really like a lot, which goes, if we don't change the direction we are headed, we will get to where we are going. And that's about changing the frame from doing things better to doing better things. Now, there are four really learning theories that we talk about in this chapter. And this is the part now where, if you may remember this from your educational psychology class when you were in graduate school or in your teacher certification programs. But the four that I want to touch on are behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, and something that is a variant of constructivism, but is very important in this kind of work, which is sociocultural theory, or what we might call critical theory. And in a nutshell, this is how these theories break down. If you are talking about behaviorism, we're talking about changes in observable behaviors. And behaviorism seems like a very outdated way to frame learning and education. But in fact, this change in observable behavior is what testing is based on. And so much of behaviorist ways of thinking still pervade current educational systems and structures. Now, cognitivism takes the ideas of behaviorism and starts to dig down and understand how the mind works. How is it that people learn and recall and are able to produce and combine ideas in interesting ways? So it's about changes in mental structures, and much modern testing theory is built around cognitive theory. And a lot of education is built around cognitivism because it's really focused on individual thinking. Now, constructivism is where things, I think, start to get really interesting. And Yael talked about the learning sciences and talked about design-based research. And a lot of the ideas in constructivism are what drive that work, which is that thinking is not about individuals, but it's really what's shared. It's how ideas and ways of doing things are stretched across cultures and systems. So if two school systems are using the same material and they're getting different outcomes, it may be because the way they think about the world differs in some way, perhaps because of their context or their background or who the teachers are or who the students are, who the parents are. These are all things that make learning very contextual. Now, sociocultural theory takes those ideas about how learning is deeply rooted in context and culture and talks about transforming the way that we participate with that culture. So that's where equity comes in. It matters, these ideas around theory, because the way that we think about the world, the deeply rooted beliefs, whether we have examined them or not, those shape the way that we imagine a learning environment should be designed. So if you believe that a learning environment should be full of students sitting in rows, quietly looking forward at the teacher, and that all the knowledge comes from the teacher for the students to learn and then repeat back, which is not different from what a lot of classrooms might look like in a lot of cultures, then you might be a behaviorist or a cognitivist. It doesn't matter if you know those terms, but that in fact is how your worldview is shaped. And if somebody says, we want those students to talk to each other, we want those students to interact, we want them to do authentic work, you might say, I don't. That doesn't sound like learning to me. If you're a cognitivist, you may get very interested in thinking about how your students are reasoning and how they solve problems on their own. That may be your target. And if you're a social constructivist, then you probably do want to interact. You want to watch how students interact with the world, interact with each other, and think about their learning as a transformation in the ways that they interact. Now, one note, because this will become important later, not just people learn, but institutions learn. So our focus in education is often on learners, and sometimes those learners are students, and sometimes those learners are teachers, and sometimes those learners are administrators. But we might benefit from thinking about how the entire system is learning and changing and growing, how the capabilities that the system has enable us to accomplish different things. How does a change in one classroom affect surrounding classrooms? How does a change in one building affect changes across the district, across the state? Those are different things to think about. How do changes in funding from the center change the way people react and do things? How does changes in the political context? These are all things that matter and that schools respond to and that learning is created within. So now let's take it from theory to practice. And I'm going to use some examples here from the educational technology world, which is the world that I come from. But perhaps some of these sound familiar to you, and I'll try to generalize them. I don't expect anyone to know all of these things. But an example of a kind of technology that shaped the way people taught and learned that was related to behaviorism were the teaching machines that B.F. Skinner and many others promoted heavily in the 1960s and 70s. And they still exist in many drill and practice type of curricula. Cognitivism gave rise to tools that may employ artificial intelligence types of techniques, although as somebody who studied artificial intelligence in some depth, I can tell you that artificial intelligence is whatever it lays just beyond what we think computers can do today. We get things like the cognitive tutors or intelligent tutoring systems that came out of places like Carnegie Mellon. If you're looking beyond those kinds of uses of technology, that's what Seymour Papert, the cognitive tutors and B.F. Skinner's teaching machines might have been what Seymour Papert called using computers to teach us or to teach the child. There's a shift in using in which the children teaches the computer. We think about computational literacy, for instance, learning how to code, but also just learning how to interact and think about the world in a very complex way. We get MIT's more recent intervention, which has a global audience, Scratch, which is a computer platform that I wager many of you have heard of. That's really built upon constructivism or social constructivism. More energy was put into thinking about the community that uses Scratch and how that community interacts with each other and can learn from and build on each other's creations than was actually put into the development of the programming platform itself. And finally, we get to sociocultural theory or critical theory, another evolution. And that's where a lot of the current improvement research lives. Because sociocultural theory is really central to equity-minded improvement research in education. That is the theory that, again, if you're interested in equity, this is where you want to spend your time sort of wrapping your head around how to think about the learning as a form of improvement of participation. So now I want to talk about 4 key principles that drive the way we think about sociocultural theory in improvement research. The first is that learning and thinking are both forms of social action. So they're about acting in the world, acting with others. Cultural tools, that includes language and other kinds of representation, they play a critical role in how we think and how we learn. So even thinking about the language of instruction matters. But thinking about whether it's a language that we only use in the classroom or it's a language that's used in practice, when we often talk about the ways that researchers and practitioners can't understand how each other talk, that's again a cultural tool challenge, right? About using language in ways that advances and not confuses. Learning and thinking reflect the values that we hold. So the ways that we structure the classroom environment, the ways that we structure the learning, the way that we structure the interaction between different participants in the work, they reflect those values, and recognizing and naming those values and trying to think about what values we collectively want to shift are very important parts of this work. And finally, the 4th principle is that learning, and education in particular, are by definition political, and they can be structured in ways that either perpetuate inequality or they can create the possibility for creating more just systems that lead to the kinds of transformative changes that I think intuitively we all realize we need and that we want, but that we often tinker around the edges in small ways and don't think at these systems levels about how the changes we want can lead to that kind of transformation. Now you have principles and goals, and I've been speaking in lofty terms, but there are also tensions. There are things that are very challenging about this kind of work. And these are the things that partnerships fundamentally need to work on together. There's even, it starts with, as Yael focuses on what's the problem. I'm not even listing that here because the problem is not attention, but the way the problem is viewed might be attention. So it's not that we have knowledge about how people learn or how one might best teach, and you want to take that knowledge and apply it in your classroom. It's what are the problems that we're working on that interest both of us, that interest both the researcher and the practitioner, that interest the funder, that interest the policymaker. There's our shared problems that we can work on together. That's what the partnership is for, not for helping me adopt an idea, but for figuring out together how we make progress on ideas. The tensions involve who gets to be involved. So who's at that table helping negotiate? I've named a lot of people, a lot of different roles. I've left out roles. I didn't mention parents. I didn't mention politicians. I didn't mention, you could go on and on and on. So who are the people who are at the table when we're having these discussions? Who is in the partnership? who gets to decide what counts as learning? So in the United States, this is an endless battle. But the No Child Left Behind legislation that was introduced in the United States in the early 2000s, actually as part of a continuous way of thinking about the only valid knowledge being knowledge that can be tested. And we all know the famous quotes about everything that that can be measured doesn't count, and what really counts can't always be measured. But deciding what counts as learning is very important. And who gets to decide what valid places are for learning? So is the only learning we value what happens in the classroom? Could it happen in the hallways? Could it happen in the homes? Could it happen in the times when we're on holiday with family? Lots of different places where important learning happens. And we tend to get focused on very narrow parts of the learning ecosystem when we're talking about this. Now, I'm just going to give one brief example of my own work. This is a project called the Center for Learning Technologies in Urban Schools, or LETIS. And the Center for Learning Technologies in Urban Schools was an early example of a research practice partnership. It was one that led actually to the way that I came to think about what Yael referred to as design-based implementation research, but it was before we had those ideas. It was a partnership between the University of Michigan and the Detroit Public Schools, our nearest big city urban system, and Northwestern University and the Chicago Public Schools. So a four-way partnership that lasted for over 13 years across multiple different kinds of funding, multiple different kinds of sub-projects and different inquiries that were raised and being promoted by different partners, different parts of the group. And it really was an interesting negotiation across all these partners about what we were working on. It really began with a very cognitive and constructivist frame, because we were focused on materials and technologies. And in fact, when we first approached Detroit and Chicago about writing this grant proposal, first I should note the partnership pre-existed the research. It had existed in various forms in earlier relationships and earlier interactions. We knew each other, we trusted each other. And when we proposed this four-way partnership, it expanded the relationships in interesting ways and brought new opportunities to bear for us to have conversations with each other. But the researchers came to the table and said, we would like to build technologies to support inquiry science. The schools said, well, that's very nice, but what we actually want are better curriculum materials for students to do science. We don't care so much about the technologies. And let us evolve to become very focused on the development of those middle school science inquiry-based learning materials supported by technology. So in other words, we negotiated around a problem, the problem being how to promote inquiry-based science learning in the middle grades. And that led to the development of different sub-projects that were some of interest to the teachers and led by the teachers, some of interest to the districts and led by people of the districts, and some of interest to the researchers and led by the researchers, but always in conversation with each other. So we each did our own thing, but in deep conversation in ways that benefited each other. As the work evolved, we started to understand, especially as we ran into challenges and where things weren't going as we hoped it would, where we started to recognize that we needed to think about the district. The level at which we thought as the work evolved kept bumping up and up and up as we recognized that this was really about changes in how the whole system thought about what the nature of learning was, how we supported learning, where learning took place, and so forth. And we actually developed this representation. If you imagine it as a three-dimensional cube, it's helpful. Where at the origin is what the current capabilities of the system were. And as you moved away from the origin of what that district could handle right now, you created a more and more challenging set of interventions that were harder for them to use. And we thought about that along three dimensions. We thought about the current capabilities of that of the district. Maybe those are technical capabilities. A technical capability might be what what a teacher's skill set is. Maybe it's what the network infrastructure is. Maybe it's what the technology available is or the curriculum materials available. We thought about the policies of the district. So in the United States, we have these very complicated relationships between teachers' unions and school districts with negotiated contracts that enable certain kinds of activity and constrain other kinds of activity. So for instance, you might have a policy that says a teacher can only participate in so many hours of professional development during the summer. And that's a constraint that must be worked within. Or maybe it's culture. Maybe it's a culture where the teachers are very excited about interacting with these ideas and want to form their own work groups and be a part of this. Or maybe it's a culture where people are suspicious of these ideas and don't want to participate. And I'm talking about teaching here, but it could be for any part of the relationship. All of this created challenges around capacity. Now, this is just one way of thinking about this world. And as we got more into thinking about DBIR, we developed other and different ways of thinking about it. But I just want to close, and then we'll open this up for conversation. There's a quote that often gets attributed to Albert Einstein. It turns out it probably wasn't from Einstein. It's probably from one of those robber baron American industrialists, Benjamin Brewster, which is that in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they are not. And I think that's a helpful way to think about, again, this tension that we're talking about and this challenge and changing the way we think. Because theory ideally is abstracted practice and practice is applied theory. And the reason I want you to think about theories is because theories may be just lenses that we apply as researchers to think about the world, but lenses do help you see, and where you focus dictates what you see. So that is my conclusion of these thoughts, and I'm happy to open this up now and see where the conversation takes us.
Thank you very much, Mary, and אני אחזור לעברית ומקווה שזה לא יקשה עליך בערוץ. אני נשתדל שכל אחד גם יגיד את השם שלו בדיון כדי שבאמת ברי יוכל גם לזהות את הדוברים, כי הוא שומע רק כל אחד כל הזמן. אז אני אשמח להתייחסויות להרצאה.
אני אשמח.
כן, בבקשה.
I'll do this in Hebrew, so I don't have to make people change to the translation, if it's okay. אז אני תקועה במקום של הסיפור של האמון. דיברת על העובדה שזה בעצם מבוסס על איזה שהיוזמה הזאת התבססה על תשתית של אמון, שממנה היא צמחה, וזה בעצם אפשר להכניס, לצאת מתוך מסגרת תיאורטית ולחקור את המרחב הזה של העניין המשותף. ואני רגע רוצה להשאיר אותנו במקום של שאלת האמון, כי אני חושבת שאנחנו הרבה פעמים אומרים את המילה אמון ואז ממשיכים הלאה, ואני עסוקה בזה הרבה מאוד בשבועות האחרונים בשאלת האמון. אני מחפשת גם את המקום של הספרות, שתעזור לי לייצר עבור עצמי את המסגרת התיאורטית שממנה אני יכולה לצאת אל הפרקטיקה, ואני לא כל כך מוצאת על מה להישען. יש הרבה ספרות שעוסקת בנושא של אמון באזורים שהם לא חינוך. יש קצת ספרות שעוסקת במקום של אמון בחינוך, אבל המרחק בין הספרות הזאת לבין הפרקטיקה הוא גדול מדי. וכשאני חושבת על מחקר ועל איך שהוא נתפס הרבה פעמים בשדה, גם כמשהו שהוא קשור לאחריותיות, כמקום שחושף אותי ומשאיר אותי פגיע אל מול הנתונים, מי בעצם רואה את הנתונים האלה. אני מניחה שמעורבות ברמות היותר גבוהות, למשל הדיסטריקט, המעורבות שלהם בנתונים שנאספים ברמת בית הספר, הופכת את זה ל-high stakes בעצם במקום low stakes, והשאלה איפה המקום הזה שבו יש את המרחב של האמון, אולי את המרווח אפילו, אני חושבת, גם את האמון אבל גם את המרווח הזה שמאפשר בעצם לראות את המחקר כמשהו שהוא באמת מקדם למידה, לעומת מחקר שבעצם יש לו משמעויות מורכבות עבור בתי הספר. אז אני לא יודעת, אני אשמח לשמוע קצת יותר על מרחב האמון ועל איך בעצם יוצרים אותו, וקצת יותר על המקום של המשקפיים, דיברת על משקפיים שדרכם אנחנו רואים את העולם, על המשקפיים התיאורטיות שאנחנו מרכיבים בשביל לראות דרכם את הפרקטיקה, אז איך אנחנו מגיעים למצב שהמשקפיים התיאורטיות האלה הם גם בעצם יוצאות מתוך, המשקפיים התיאורטיות בעצם צריכות גם לצאת מתוך איזשהו מקום פרקטי. אז יש פה איזושהי תנועה שהיא משולשת מהפרקטיקה לתיאוריה ומהתיאוריה לפרקטיקה. אז אלה מעברים שגם אני אשמח לשמוע קצת יותר.
Odette, I think you've raised one of the key issues, and that's why partnership research is such a valuable tool. But belief, so first, belief and trust can't be, I think the US political conversation now certainly shows that over and over again. And they are built. They're built through long relationships with each other. And in fact, with the work that I shared from Detroit, it took a while for Detroit and the University of Michigan to develop a space where we could trust each other and where we shared beliefs. Many teachers are very used to the researcher who will appear in the district, ask for their partnership, their cooperation. Remember, Yael had that one slide that showed the relationship between cooperation and collaboration. And maybe they'll help out because they're interested in this question and they're interested in new ideas, but then they don't believe that the researcher will come back next year. And usually we don't. And one of the things that led us to greater and greater accomplishments in the lettuce work was that we did come back every year, and eventually, after 3 or 4 years, the teachers in Detroit said, "Oh, I guess you guys are still here. I guess we're doing this together." And it invited in a whole new group of people who started to trust that there was something to this relationship and that we weren't there just for our benefit, but we were there for mutual benefit. And that's why we build partnerships. And it's a process that takes time. And in those conversations, you talk about belief. Because, and this is where the theory may be interesting and useful, but if you believe that learning is a process of repetition, then you're unlikely to want to do one of these activities that involve hands-on learning and interaction with each other. Your assessments may be very out of line with the kinds of learning that you're trying to produce. But if you don't put those ideas on the table early, then how can you possibly make progress? And I would say that a lot of the reason why so many sort of good ideas in education go away quickly and fail to make a real impact is because we didn't ever take time to figure out whether they were ideas that match with the beliefs that we share together, or to build a process to change those beliefs. So Adam put a link to a book. Adam Lufstein put a link to a book in the chat. I'm not familiar with that particular book. I don't think there's not. I would say there's probably not a 5 or 10 step guide, right, to changing belief. There is a 5 or 10 year process, and if you don't start on that path, then it'll never happen. And if you don't stick to that path, it'll never happen.
That's a challenge.
בוריס, רצית להתייחס?
I wanted to ask, if I may, Barry, somehow your overview of theories of learning was for me very thinking provoking in the context of RPP. By definition, RPP is a social cultural phenomenon, and researchers interested in RPP are usually in this orientation. But as you say, in practice, we can find many instantiations of all four understandings of learning. So do you think that partnership is possible, for make a partnership possible, partners need to share their vision of learning, or they can belong to different paradigms and somehow develop this basis for partnership in relation to learning?
That's a great question, Boris. So first, all four theories are always present. They're just different ways, I say, of explaining the world. I think that in order for the practice, that is the goal of the partnership, to come into being, to be successful, then you do eventually have to agree on the sort of on the basic goals of that process, right? And what you're getting out of it. Now, I think you don't need for everyone to embrace sociocultural theory. Sociocultural theory describes what the partnership is, how the partnership operates. Whether or not you believe in it, it does simply, it's one explanation for how partnerships work. You do need to understand, and a partnership, by the way, could work together to develop a behaviorist teaching machine. That's fine, as long as all members of the partnership agree with each other that that's what the goal is, and that goal aligns with what we're doing. So you see what I'm doing there? I'm talking about sort of different levels of thinking about theory. What's important is that the partners are all on the same page with what they're trying to build, not that they are all socioculturalists. Sociocultural theory is, for me, the way of explaining why a partnership works at all.
Thank you.
Iris?
מאוד מוזר לי לדבר בעברית. את יכולה גם לדבר באנגלית, הערוץ הוא סימולטני. אבל אז כולם יצטרכו ללחוץ. וגם אני מדברת לכולם, לא רק לברי. רציתי להתייחס לנושא של אמון וגם לאיזושהי תמה שעלתה מוקדם יותר בשיחה לגבי הנושא של איים לעומת יבשה. ואני חושבת שאולי אחת השאלות שיכולה אולי לקדם מאי ליבשה זה האם וכיצד אנחנו יכולים לעשות העברה של אמון, בגלל שברי דיבר על כך שאמון יכול להיבנות וזה לוקח הרבה זמן, ואז אני מאמינה שאיים יכולים באמת לטפח אמון הדדי. אני חושבת שבעיות של אמון קיימות לשני הכיוונים, או לכל הכיוונים של כל השותפים. ולו יכולנו להגיע למצב שיש העברה, ושסיפורי הצלחה, מקומות שבהם נוצר קשר, שנוצרה הדדיות, שזה יכול איכשהו להדביק אחרים, ואולי קצת לשים קצת חורים בשריון ההגנה של חוסר האמון, זה יכול לקדם את לקראת יבשות.
Such a great observation. And it kind of goes back also to Odette's original question. And, how do you change belief? Well, one way to change beliefs is to see something that works somewhere that you want. So what's the existence proof? And that's a great way to change a belief, right? Is if somebody says, well, I don't think that way. I don't want to work with you the way you want to work. Okay. If that's important to understand, and I shouldn't start trying to convince you to change. But what we might do is start talking about goals. And if there's a shared goal and there's somebody over there doing something interesting on that island, we can start to, well, now we don't want to fill in waterways, but we can start to create lands, not islands. I will say it does introduce the next level too, right? Is when somebody says, well, how do I get that, what they have, that success? That's where it's important to reintroduce the bigger conversation, right? Around all the things that go into that success. not just that it can't easily be imported.